Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you to Ali and the Global Security Forum for making this conversation possible. I know that this has been a panel that's been high on everybody's minds, and you know, with the star quality on display on stage here, I can see why. I'm going to swing straight into the Q&A here because you want to hear from the panel as much as possible and from me as little as possible. I'm going to start by taking you back to a painful moment, perhaps, a little more than a year and a half ago, when Kabul fell, when the US withdrew and the Taliban returned. People in this room and rooms like this around the world at that point were speculating about what to expect from the new Taliban government. There were expressions like Taliban 2.0. There was talk that this was the new improved Taliban, and that it wouldn't be as it had been before. So I'm going to start by asking each of you to talk a little bit about what you expected on that fateful day and what has come to pass since then. Fawzia, why don't you start?
Thank you. It's a great opportunity to be here, and thank you for giving this slot to Afghanistan. I know there are so many competing agendas globally, and Afghanistan, with all the problems, is no longer making headlines. I understand that, but nonetheless, it's one of the chronic kind of conflict that we always have to keep an eye on. Well, Taliban, I was negotiating with Taliban, and you know that. The narrative they sold to the world, which is also specific in the agreement, the Doha agreement between the United States and the Taliban, their narrative was that they will fight other military extremist groups, including Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and bring security. That they have changed. There are Taliban 2.0. And even during the negotiation, what they were offering to us was that they will accommodate the transformed Afghanistan into their political agendas. Obviously, what we had hoped for was a successful end of the negotiation, as a result of which there is a government acceptable by everybody and representative of all the segment of the society. We know that it didn't go the way we had expected, especially after the former president fled and the way the country fell to the Taliban. From day one, and even from the time that I was negotiating, I came to this understanding that that the Taliban are, their narrative is wrong. They're creating a narrative of for us to believe them that they have changed, but in reality, it's the same Taliban, because the ideology and the existence of Taliban is based on that hegemony of power and ideology. The moment they open up, and they kind of melt into the society, their existence is a matter of a question. So the two narratives that they have sold is Taliban bringing security, and that's why the world wanted them to bring security for Afghanistan and for the rest of the world. We know that that they have failed in that as well, because security for me is not only end of an active battlefield. We all know that. And also in that, they have failed because we know since they have taken over, there is a growth of ISIS and other military extremists in Afghanistan. We know that in August, the Al-Qaeda leader was killed just a few meters away from Palace, but also on the fact that they have changed. Obviously, they haven't changed. So both narratives on the basis of which the world talked to them and we wanted to talk to them actually failed.
I want to come back to your point about whether or not they can change and the question of ideology. But Hekmat, let me turn to you first. Is there a Taliban 2.0? Is there a Taliban 1.5? Is there, as some people suggest, it's Taliban 1.0 with cell phones? What were your expectations and how far have they come?
Sure. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Let me start by thanking Ali, Noreen, and Susan for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. On August 15th, I was in Kabul. A few days before the collapse, I was in touch with both Taliban members that were on the ground and also Taliban that were in Doha. I remember at that time there was absolutely no plan for the Taliban to enter Kabul. I had spoken to several individuals, and they told me that we're waiting for a delegation to come to Kabul, from Kabul to Doha, and then to negotiate. And at around 1 o'clock, the former president left and fled the country. And it just created this massive chaos. During that day itself, it was just enormous amount of pain. But going back from mid-2018 till the collapse on 15 August 2021, I spent that 3.5 years shuttling between Kabul and Doha, working on the peace process. We had discussions with the Taliban here on dozens of times. We had negotiations in Moscow and in a few other places. And we spoke about the future of Afghanistan. We spoke about civil liberties, we spoke about institutions, we spoke about women's rights and all of that. And there was a general consensus that we're going to work on these things collectively. Yet, after the collapse, very unfortunately, many of those ideas, many of those specific points that we had agreed upon are not looked at. They are not rationalized, and unfortunately, at least the lessons that we thought would have been learned are not. Thus, many of these issues that we look at now, whether it's particularly girls' education and things like that, many of us are quite disappointed on.
Saad, I want you to address from the point of view of a media person, a media owner. To some of us, Tolo News and the future of Tolo News is the canary in the coal mine, is the test of what the new Afghanistan under the Taliban look like. What were you expecting the Taliban to allow your news organization to do, and to what degree have your expectations been met or not?
Well, it's been up and down. Initially, I mean, their arrival in mid-August was a surprise, and yet it wasn't a surprise. It just happened very quickly. And we continued our work, but expecting to get shut down. And initially, they were actually quite accommodating and tolerant, simply because they didn't have the bandwidth. But then they became quite restrictive in terms of the way that, in terms of media, in terms of women appearing on television and so forth, in particular music and entertainment programs. But the last few months, we've noticed more flexibility as people are getting to know their portfolios and they have relationships with the media outlets and journalists. You know, there's more, I wouldn't say tolerance, but at least there's dialogue, people talking to each other. So, you know, we've had people in specific positions now for months, and they're getting to know their jobs pretty well. And, you know, we're noticing similar things at the Ministry of Finance and other places. They're learning on the job, and we're seeing that today as far as the media is concerned. But because the Taliban movement is not a monolithic movement, you have different individuals with different views. The policies show, you know, if you judge them by their policies, they haven't changed. But if you judge what the individuals say, certainly the way they see things have changed. And I think one of the interesting things right now is this internal, intra-Taliban tug of war that it's not really that apparent to the outside world. It's a serious one, and there's serious debate. And interestingly enough, the media in Afghanistan is playing an interesting role in terms of reflecting different points of view of the Taliban individuals, where they come forward and talk about, you know, this very centralized way of governing, or women's rights, or education, and so forth. And this is in the airwaves. People are discussing this on a daily basis, important Taliban individuals, and we're witness to that, and obviously play an important role in that. So it's fairly mixed. You know, it's been up and down. It's been a roller coaster the last 18 months.
What are some of the things you're not allowed to do on the news side? I understand about music and entertainment, but on the news side, what are some stories you're not allowed to cover?
Well, I mean, I think that for things like, you know, questioning the leader, and, you know, he's almost a, you know, sort of semi-religious figure nowadays. Yes. But even that's changing. You know, the discussing issues such as Daesh and its role and the way we cover it, you know, that's changed. It's been up and down. But but I think some of the individuals, and you know, there have been some very impressive people, both on the media side, also on the finance side. They're learning on the job very, very quickly. But it's also people getting to know each other. I think that's an important thing. But having said that, I mean, even the previous government, there were issues that, you know, we were not able to cover simply because it was too controversial. As you would not cover Modi in India or some Erdogan in Turkey. I mean, in our neck of the woods, you always have limitations.
By the way, you guys should jump into the conversation anytime you like. But Fawzia, to go back to what you said at the start, you were suggesting, if I got this right, that the Taliban, for the sake of their own identity and their own self-preservation, cannot afford to change. If they changed, their reason to exist would disappear. If they accommodated themselves to the new Afghanistan or the international community, that they would automatically dissolve. But when you hear Saad talk about sort of intra-Taliban disagreement over the right direction, does that give you any sense of hope that it's possible? That at least within the organization, it's not, as Saad says, it's not a monolith, but there might be gaps that the international community, that Afghans, that people like yourself might be able to take advantage of those gaps to get Afghan people what they need?
Well, for years, we have been engaged with them with the hope that we will be able to influence.
Yes.
And change their views on some of the issues, because obviously what Taliban offer and what Taliban do in Afghanistan is not common in any other Muslim country, right?
Yes.
In fact, what they do is in contradiction with Islamic principles. We know that when it comes to their approach on women's rights and girls' education, but we also know that women's rights and girls' education is not the only problem. Right. So suppose if tomorrow the Taliban allow girls to go to school, what do we expect? When they have absolutely reformed the curricula, the new generation of people who graduate from schools will be a generation of radicalized who embraces suicide bombing. Why do we want our girls to go to such schools, right? So by allowing girls to school nowadays, it's only the mental health that we could help, because obviously the women of Afghanistan are undergoing enormous mental health challenge by not being allowed to leave their homes. This morning I was talking to my colleagues in some of the provinces, and they were telling me that they now don't allow women to hold the phone with the camera. So it's not even about, you know, what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed. It's the sense of control and that, you know, the feeling that you are always being watched and controlled for your gender, or for even the male. So speaking about the change on Taliban, as a group, as an ideological movement, I still believe that their perspective towards main issues that form their existence is the same. However, some of them have been exposed to these international life. They were in different countries. Their families are still in different countries. Their daughters go to school. Yes. Their sons go to play sports, which is good. And they speak about that. I challenged one of the Taliban guy 2 weeks ago in one of the media, and I said, is your daughter going to school? And he said, Alhamdulillah, which he's very proud of his daughter going to school, which we are also very proud. But why not you apply the same policies that you want for your own family, for the rest of the community? Because that, as I said before, their own existence and the fact that they were formed will be questioned. So I think as a movement, unless there is a big shift in terms of you know, the fragmentation that is there obviously between Kabul and Kandahar, or they say Kandahari people, Kandahari leaders, I think I would divide them in three categories. There will be further fragmentation as we move forward, but I'm not expecting a major shift unless there is a serious change within the Taliban movement. In terms of, there were some expectations when the 21st of December edict happened, issued about banning girls from university, and 26th December edict banning women from working with international organizations. There was that hope that this will further enlarge that internal division, but we know recently there was a trip by security ministers to Kandahar, which we heard from, what we heard is that they were in an apologetic mode to the leader for their you know, public statements. So I think moving forward there will be further fragmentation. This is something we have to all use as a leverage, but to have that dramatic change of policy because some of these Taliban are speaking nicely to us and to international community, I don't expect that.
Hekmat, As you said, you were part of the negotiating process here, Moscow, other places, over a 3-year period. And so you've had sort of, you've watched the evolution of at least the people who were in the negotiating table with you. Many of them got to live in places like this, in hotels like this. Their families came here, their daughters went to school. They partook of the benefits, if you like, of modern life. And yet when they got to power, they seem a little reluctant to share that with the Afghan people. On the issue of women's rights and girls going to school, throughout the negotiating process, it must have been clear to them that this is the barometer by which they will be judged over all other things by the international community. Everybody's eyes will be on what they do with girls, specifically girls' education. And yet, the fact that they've made these decisions, it seems almost willful. It seems like they're trying to poke the international community in the eye to say, you thought that we were changing? There you go. Words that I can't use in a family-friendly gathering. Why do you think they've done that? It seems so damaging, so unnecessary, but so deliberate. Why, to put yourself in the heads of the people that you shared rooms and meals with, why did they do this?
Yeah, I will recall a particular conversation. We were in a conference in Moscow, and it was 2019. I think Ms. Kufi was also there. One of the Taliban very senior individuals, he gave a 45-minute lecture on the rights of women in Islam. And he started with the wife of the Holy Prophet, by mentioning that she was not only a businesswoman, but she proposed to the Holy Prophet. And it started with that. And the conversation went that in Islam, a woman can become a minister, a woman has the right to work, a woman can become all the way to the president and become a president. There were 3 particular issues that they mentioned that they could not do, which some people looked at. Yet, once they came to power, many of those individuals became ministers. And when you speak to them saying, look, here's what you discussed, here's what you promised the Afghan people, they tell you very openly that either they don't have the leverage or they don't have the capacity to change their decision. Very straightforward, they tell you. Now, some of the arguments that they put forth is that why are girls banned from education? They said initially they wrapped it in the context of religion. But in Islam, everyone knows that boys and girls, it's obligatory to have education. Then they went to culture and tradition, which in the Afghan culture and tradition is also false. Even in the last few decades, in the most remote places, Afghan wanted schools where their girls can go and be educated. And lastly, some of them are talking about environment, logistic, and things like that. But school and boys and girls are already segregated in Afghanistan, so it's not like they're going to school together. So at the end of the day, regardless of what excuse they make, it's unjustifiable, it's cruel, and it's inhumane to continue to keep 50% of the population from reaching their aspiration. It's about their future, it's about a decision that should rest with them, not with someone else.
So why do you think they're doing that, though? We can agree that it's cruel, but it seems like deliberate cruelty that harms even the Taliban's own interests. Why? Is it just ideology?
But even ideology, look, if it's about ideology, in the last couple of months we've had delegation, religious clerics from Saudi Arabia, we've had delegations from Indonesia, from Turkey, from so many Muslim countries. Some of the clerics that work with them very closely in Pakistan, they came and told them that this has no religious weight, yet they continue to do it, whether it's for some sort of negotiation tactic, whether it's about particularly keeping the movement together. For whatever reason, overwhelming majority of Afghans will tell you that it's wrong.
Okay. Well, since we're talking about excuses, so it was suggested to me actually in this forum a couple of days ago by somebody that part of hesitation on the part of the Taliban is the knowledge that they now have what they didn't when they ran the country before. They have domestic competition from Daesh, from ISIS. And they're worried that if they show any laxity from their point of view, if they show any laxity on ideology, that a lot of their foot soldiers and mid-level commanders and perhaps even more senior commanders will abandon the Taliban, will hold them responsible for loosening their standards and move en masse to Daesh. Is that just an excuse, or is that a realistic outcome?
Well, as all things, it's probably all of the above. Firstly, let me just point out, Afghanistan has changed dramatically over the last 20 years. It's the youngest country outside of sub-Saharan Africa, median age of 18. It's been vastly urbanized in this period. And the younger population, if you look at our literacy rate, which is about 35 or so percent, but if you look at the younger generation of Afghans, a clear majority is literate. So, and the Taliban are from Afghanistan, and over the last 18 months, they've heard and they've seen for themselves how much the country has changed. So the Taliban of August 2021 is very different to the Taliban of today. They have seen things for themselves, and they can feel the pressure in terms of domestic demands for education and so forth. I'm not going to get into as to why they're deliberately coming up with these policies. That's another discussion altogether. But in terms of today, what's going on with Daesh and the violence, let me point out, violence has dropped significantly from the pre-Taliban period. You know, we're not losing tens of thousands of people annually. It's far less. Is Daesh a threat? It's not an existential threat, but it's a threat nonetheless. If you look at the numbers, we're talking about 8,000 or so Daesh fighters in Afghanistan, which is significant. A lot of people returning from Syria are joining Daesh. Some members of the existing foreign terrorist organizations are joining Daesh, and some Taliban members are joining Daesh. And there are a whole range of reasons why. There's money, there's ideology, and so forth. But clearly, their presence in Afghanistan is shifting the narrative to the extreme. So they don't have to hold territory, they don't even have to be that powerful, but the fact that they're advocating for a more restrictive, more radical form of Islam, even when it comes to education, of course, that's going to be a concern that the Taliban leadership will have. So yes, it has an impact. And today, I mean, one of the things that, you know, and I'm sure a lot of folks here are interested in this, in terms of Daesh and all the other foreign terrorist organizations, you know, I warn that we should not look at these movements or organizations in isolation. We have to look at the whole jihadi ecosystem and how complicated Afghanistan has become. For example, Taliban fighters in Kandahar joining the TTP, IMU and, you know, ITIM fighters shifting over to Daesh, and so forth and so forth. And so this radical ecosystem, this sort of extremist ecosystem is impacting even Taliban policies today.
You gave me a look suggesting you wanted to come in on that, and then you.
On the security aspect and the lives, there is, based on, obviously it's always difficult to collect accurate data, but based on the information that we can access, there are 500 people that were killed by Taliban under the name of what they can claim Daesh or any other military groups since 1 year, most of them proven to be innocent people just because they oppose them. And also in terms of civilian casualty, since last year, since April, like it's going to be 1 year, more than 2,000 people were killed on different attacks. So I think the war that Taliban choose on Daesh is also very picky. They can just dismantle and kill people that they don't like and then name it Daesh. There is no culture of, accountability. Nobody holds them accountable. And I think also by international community, because I know there are a lot of important people here in this room, why is it that in the case of Afghanistan, we set the bar so low and we expect the minimum? You know, when the international community engaged with Taliban, we accept as international community, as international organizations, as UN, as different countries, that the norm is discrimination. And the exception is that we negotiate with them if you allow us to send our few female staff to the offices. You know, it is okay for people who are in the wanted list, leave alone the FBI or the UN, the sanction list. In the minds of the people of Afghanistan, they're criminals. They can hold the office position and the world is proud to take a picture with them. The world engagement with Taliban has always been a security-centric lens, right? You dismantle one military extremist group, in this case Daesh, with another one, in this case Taliban. While the Taliban's victory and the way the ground was paved for them to come to power actually inspired, probably in this case inspired is a positive word, but motivated a lot of other military extremist groups to choose the same path, which imposes and endangers enormous amount of insecurity to the global security. So my question is to everyone, why are we putting our standards so minimum when it comes to Afghanistan? The people of Afghanistan don't deserve that. I think the people of Afghanistan were a reliable partner for the last 20 years at least, but throughout our history, to the world. They deserve a better, handling of the situation.
Hekmat?
Just in terms of getting a better understanding of Daesh, it has become a really potent, a very serious group to deal with. When the Taliban came to Kabul, they opened many of the prisons, including Bagram prison and others, and there were 2,000 Daesh members that were released immediately, along with the members of the Taliban. And many of those
this is just out of the euphoria of the moment,
this
or was it deliberate that
No, immediately after,
immediately,
any province that the Taliban went to, the immediate action was release all the prisoners, especially all the Taliban prisoners. And there was no distinction between who was Taliban, who was Daesh, so they released those 2,000 hardcore Daesh members. Now what is happening is that you have people from Central Asia, you have the Chinese, you have particularly individuals from the Middle East, and you have individuals from the region, including Pakistan and other countries that are now joining Daesh. And they're targeting two sets of targets. First, they're targeting minorities. In enormous amount of attacks. They are going after minorities in mosques, in education center, and sadly neither the public or even now, many of these minorities are not being protected. That's one. Second, Daesh is targeting internationals. So they targeted the Russian embassy, they targeted a Chinese guest house, they targeted recently several other targets. And because of these efforts, now the Saudi Arabian embassy was closed in Afghanistan, and there are many who are thinking about that. So Daesh has become a force that the Taliban have to deal with. Just about 5 days ago, one of the most well-known Taliban governor was assassinated by Daesh in Mazar-e-Sharif. Several Taliban ideologues have been killed by Daesh. So it's something that they have to realize that it's only becoming stronger and not weaker.
Saad, a year and a half ago, you and I talked about some of this, and one of the discussions that we had, and this is a discussion being had around the world, which is who now is the Taliban whisperer? Who talks to the Taliban, and who in the international community, who talks for the Taliban? In the previous iteration, Taliban 1.0, Pakistan assumed that role, or we assumed that Pakistan had that role. A year and a half ago, it was thought that perhaps Qatar would play that role. I think, it seems very unclear now. Who has influence with the Taliban that can be brought to bear? The Pakistanis, the Qataris, the Iranians, the Chinese. Who has any kind of leverage with the Taliban that might be useful to try and solve any of these problems that you're all bringing up?
I think no one, really. And what I think everyone, obviously people have their relationships and they talk to the Taliban. In particular, I'm talking about the leader in Kandahar, or attempt to. But it's become apparent, especially on the issue of education, as well as these foreign fighters, including the TTP, then really no one has leverage. And it goes up and down. I mean, the Pakistanis were euphoric when the Taliban first came in, and Faiz Ahmed was in Kabul at the Serena Hotel looking very happy. But since then, clearly the Pakistanis are not getting their way, and they have buyer's remorse. And it shifts. I mean, today, the rumor, the talk is that the Iranians have a great deal of influence in Kandahar because they have a lot of issues, regional, local issues like the issue with water and the border issues between Afghanistan and Iran, as well as Daesh and so forth. And there's an understanding, or at least some working relationship of sorts in terms of dealing with Daesh. And the Europeans and the Americans talk to the ministers in Kabul, who obviously have their limitations in terms of bigger policies, but on the day-to-day stuff, there's a working relationship. So I think no one has that much influence, and that's why it's such a challenge to work with them. And of course, I think the other interesting thing which has become apparent to the Taliban is that on paper, this deeply centralized way of governing is not working out for them. In opposition, it sort of worked out. They had a council, they made decisions, they had the symbolic leader. And even in the 90s, Mullah Omar was the absolute emir. Nonetheless, he consulted with people. But over the last 18 months, they're realizing that all the big decisions are made in Kandahar, and there's a degree of frustration amongst the sort of senior Kabul-based individuals. And I think that's why I think it's an interesting thing to watch in the coming months and weeks, because I don't think this can, the status quo will be very difficult to maintain for a number of reasons, including their own issues.
That's interesting. At the time, after our conversation, I wrote a piece based quite a lot on what you told me, which is that when we ask about whether or not there is a Taliban 2.0, we're asking the wrong question. The real fact is that there is an Afghanistan 2.0. And the Taliban has to accommodate itself to that as much as the other way around. And we often in these, and I'm guilty of this so far in this discussion myself, which is that we keep talking about the Taliban and we forget that there are 35, 40 million, depending on how you count them, Afghans who are caught up in the middle of this.
40 million Afghans,
Yeah.
3% population growth, the last numbers I saw. And Afghanistan's population will be about 100 million by 2060 or 70. It'll be the 16th largest country in the world. And it's the youngest country in all of Asia.
And an enormous proportion of that population is in enormous distress, desperately in need of humanitarian assistance, food, basic sort of building blocks of life. The community, the international community seems to be hampered by the question of, can they provide that assistance through the Taliban? Some of this is a philosophical question, an ideological question, but it's also a practical question. If you give money or assistance to the Taliban, will it go to the right hands? Will it be misused? And so on and so forth. We're still having that conversation a year and a half later, Fawzia. Where do you stand on this?
Absolutely. Afghanistan, a country with more than $3 trillion underground for natural resources, located in a very, very strategic location connecting Central and South Asia. As somebody who was representing people, I feel bad and heart-wrenching to see we're still talking about humanitarian aid in the form of one bag of flour or 1 can of oil to the people after all those years. Obviously, I just had a few days ago a meeting with a senior UN official when I was in New York for the Committee on the States of Women, and the person said that the Taliban claimed that they have $2 billion in reserve that they have created through domestic revenue in the last 2 years, means that, or 1.5 years, means that they have improved their system of so-called governance, that they have collected that revenue. Now, yet, they have a good division of labor. They want the international community to feed the people of Afghanistan. So the Taliban leader, in one of his speeches, he said, we have no responsibility to feed and serve people, it's the God's responsibility. So they want the God and the rest of the world to feed the people of Afghanistan. And what they want to do is through the money they claim, which is something to be verified, obviously, that they have increased. They want to only pay for their soldiers. Why do they pay for their soldiers? First of all, they want to keep their soldiers because they are protecting some level of insurgency against them. Be it Daesh or other military groups, they expect that. Secondly, as you pointed out earlier, they're worried about their insurgents group, about their foot soldiers joining Daesh. Because they have said, Afghanistan, we need to fight because Islam is at risk. They have brainwashed all these new generation of Taliban, and they fought for protecting Islam. But when they came to the cities, I was in Kabul and I was under house arrest for 2 weeks by Taliban. One of their guys who was outside my gate accompanied me one day to go and meet President Karzai. On the way, he was like, he was speaking a very intense Pashto, which I also had a problem understanding it, that I see in the city, women are wearing the scarf, the city looks okay, but we were told otherwise. We were told that, in Kabul, everything is just, people are infidel, everything is against Islam. Now, how do you keep, and he actually asked me to help him get a scholarship. How do you keep that soldier? By paying. So they pay the soldiers, and in fact, I was recently in some border areas of Afghanistan because I miss it. I haven't been into my country for more than 1.5 years, and I have never hoped for this. I went to some closer areas to watch the situation, and I could see that they're actually building training camp for their military. Now the question is, where do they get the money if they are not paying for the people? On the humanitarian aid question, obviously it's a very fine line between how do you feed people and avoid, kind of supporting Taliban. This has happened in Syria, this has happened in Palestine, it's going to happen anywhere, and the humanitarian aid of $40 million going every week to the central bank of Taliban is, in a way or the other, supporting Taliban. On the other hand, you have a society which is obviously in dire situation. They need to be supported. Now, I know that the UN announced the life-saving trial period for 6 months. This is something we need to watch. As somebody who is standing on principles, I hope the world will also do not put their principles of inclusion on the basis of no discrimination when it comes to humanitarian aid on negotiation with Taliban. They don't put that for negotiation.
There are two issues. Can I jump in?
And then I have a specific question for you. So
first, in terms of leverage, when you look at the leverage of the international community during the Republic period, the leverage really came from the United States and European and Western countries. A lot of the region had not a significant amount of influence. However, that has changed now. Whatever leverage the region has is absolutely much more than what the Western countries have, particularly the United States. That's one side of thing. And second, in terms of who has leverage over the Taliban does not allow anyone else to speak for themselves. They want to be dealt with directly, and they want to make sure that everyone knows that they are the government that should be engaged. That's one. Second, on humanitarian assistance, and I think we need to be very clear about one point, that we should not politicize that. Specifically, there's about 6 million Afghans who need humanitarian assistance. The cold that we just passed was responsible for killing several hundred babies during the night. I mean, I'm hearing conversation where families have to decide between food and heat. And it's a very difficult situation. So I think we need to rationalize that the money that comes into Afghanistan does not really go to the Taliban, that it goes to the Central Bank of Afghanistan, it goes to a private bank, and from there it goes to the UN, and the UN is able to distribute it. That at least the perspective that we're constantly following. So I think we should not really play politics when it comes to humanitarian assistance, and particularly where money is going to places where it's needed.
Hekmat, whether that's right or not, that train has left the station. Politics is already being played, and by both sides, I would argue. But you have, in our conversations before this discussion, you emphasized not so much on who should speak for the Taliban, but who should speak to the Taliban. And you have a theory on that. I'll let you expound on that a little bit and then come back with some questions.
You see, there are many Taliban members who have spent decades in Guantanamo, who have spent time in prisons that have been not really human rights friendly. And there are circumstances now where there are Western countries who are going and preaching to the Taliban. They're talking about human rights and things like that. And sadly, afterwards, when you have conversations with these individuals, they say, look, you're in no moral ground to preach to me about these things. Yes. And I think that dichotomy has to change. I think the only people that should really be able to speak to the Taliban are two categories. First, those Afghans that come together are able to gather their thoughts, put their ideas on paper, and specifically not those Afghans that were responsible for the collapse, but those Afghans that still have legitimacy should be able to talk to Afghans. And the second part really is that there are elements within the Muslim Ummah, within the Muslim community that have leverage and influence to be able to talk to them. And I think any dialogue or any engagement coming from the West automatically is shot down because they say this is another Western project and it should not be pushed. So it should be about Afghans taking the lead, Afghans taking the ownership and directly engaging the Taliban.
Saad, do you see people with that kind of credibility? I mean, the risk, of course, is that anybody speaking to the Taliban, even if they are Afghans, the risk is that they will be marked then as stooges of the West. Oh, you cooperated with the West before, you're coming to us as...
Or the other way around.
Or the other way around.
You're seen as a Taliban apologist. Well, listen, they're in charge. It's a reality we have to accept. And no one's going to remove them in the very short term. There's no real opposition. There's Daesh, obviously, and there are other smaller groups, but they're not that... They haven't been particularly effective over the last 18 months. So they're a reality we have to deal with. And whether we like it or not, the fate of 40 million Afghans are in their hands. And as Hekmat pointed out, I think that if you look at Afghans under the poverty line, we're talking about 20, 25 million people. Just in terms of their economic management, this year I think they're expected to raise about $2 billion. The previous government raised $2.5 billion, but the economy has collapsed, basically. Yeah. 60–70% reduction in terms of the size of the economy. So they've been fairly effective in terms of money collection, but the international community is still giving a lot of money to the Afghans. $2.8 billion, if you look at this year, which is significant. It's not as much as it used to be, but it's still very significant. And I think Fawzia has a point that, for example, they're spending, when the international community gives money to the health sector, then the Taliban don't have to spend money in the health sector. So they can retain some of those funds for other reasons, and they're not particularly transparent. So it's fairly complicated. But as Hekmat pointed out, we cannot punish the Afghan population because of the Taliban. We have been lucky that the tragedy that many foresaw hasn't really happened. But we're only weeks away from it happening again. And there's no doubt that the international community, because of its commitments in Ukraine and so forth, and most Western economies facing headwinds, will reduce that assistance. So harder times are ahead for us. And I think, but what's also interesting is that over the last 18 months, there are Taliban who take their jobs very seriously in terms of being in charge. And I think there's this ongoing engagement with the international community. They're also learning on the job in terms of what the country needs. The hubris and arrogance that I saw early on, you don't see that anymore with these guys. And I think to an earlier point, the movement's important, the ideology is important, but also, it's about power, it's about influence, and they want to be able to continue doing this. So is there an opportunity for them to open up a little bit more, to not be that ideological and dogmatic? And I think perhaps, and that's why this engagement is so important.
Fawzia, you started out by noting, why does this keep going off? I think every time you switch it on, mine goes off. You started by noting that the international community has moved on. Afghanistan is no longer in the front pages. In fact, it moved on pretty quickly after August 2021. Now we're all distracted by Ukraine and Russia, tensions with China. As I said this yesterday in another context, I'm a professional cynic. I don't have any hope that the international community will get its act together and turn and face Afghanistan again and try to solve those problems. The problems, if they are to be solved, the solutions have to come from within. How much faith do you have in the new Afghanistan, the new young Afghanistan, being able to put pressure from below upon the Taliban leadership to force change?
I believe there are four ways that hopefully will result to a change. First of all, that dynamic Afghanistan, where now the movement is led by women, right? Small in numbers. I'm not claiming that hundreds of the women go to protest. In the context of Afghanistan and the enormous security risk they face, and we know that some of them were arbitrarily detained, that their families were under pressure. My own colleagues were, including my own colleagues, detained, but they still go to the streets to protest. So that transformation is now being reflected by women of Afghanistan. So that will continue. And Taliban, honestly, as much as they are expert on fighting, they don't know how to handle that transformed Afghanistan, including the women movement. That's why you see them when there is a movement, they directly shoot at the protesters, because they don't know how to handle that small group of women protesters. So this is the first thing. The second is further fragmentation within the group itself is going to be, a means of pressure and leverage by all of us. The third is international consensus. I don't see an international consensus in the case of Afghanistan. Obviously, one policy shift we know by Taliban is their engagement with the region. The region has two motifs in the engagement. One is the security lens. Many of the Central Asian countries and other immediate neighbors of Afghanistan, they obviously want to protect their own soils and territories from the groups that might pose security threat from Afghanistan. And we know that there is now 25 military extremist groups operate in these areas, right? So the world consensus, I don't see that. I spoke at the Security Council a few months ago, and I could see that immediately there was a discussion on Afghanistan, but then the superpowers went to their own fight on Ukraine, on discussion around Afghanistan. The last is, if we could give the political space for a political opposition to be formed. There is no space. Except the women are given these kind of platforms. No space is being given to the political opposition to form themselves. Obviously, it's not possible inside the country, because we know that anybody who speaks in opposition to Taliban, they are arrested, even civic activists, etc. So that has to come from the region, or that has to be formed somewhere. But there is no space. So the four elements will put hands together. And I think the regional approach is very, very important, the Islamic countries approach. I mean, Qatar is a highlight of the diplomacy when it comes to peace and conflict resolution. We know that in Qatar, there are 12 to 15% more girls in school than boys. So the Islamic countries really have a responsibility to meaningfully and genuinely, stop Taliban by misinterpreting the religion that they are now doing that. But obviously the West as well, the West, I agree, is minimizing its leverage. The US and other international communities, they are engaged with Taliban. Taliban would love to take pictures with them, and we know that they use any opportunity to put the picture on social media first when they engage with any foreign diplomat. So they would love to engage, and they would love the world to continue to feed the people of Afghanistan with zero accountability from their side.
Saad, do you agree with those four proposals? Do you have any others to add?
Well, I think we have to almost try everything. But what's important, the realization for me, and it's been, the communists took power in April of 1978, and the Russians invaded late December of 1979. And obviously, Afghans haven't had much of a say when countries invade you and fund different groups within your country. And we've had many countries involved in Afghanistan. But I think the realization for me is we have to sort out our own things. And how we do it, it's obviously very complicated. But nonetheless, and many Taliban also share these views that we've become with a sense of entitlement, this nation with a sense of entitlement, sort of a beggar nation, always demanding that the world solve our problems. And of course, the world continues to have leverage. It's important, but I think we have to start talking amongst ourselves, including with the Taliban. I think doing it inside of Afghanistan is perhaps more important. There's not much space. I think Fawzia is right. Every time we put someone on television, some of the more outspoken ones, they get locked up for a couple of weeks and they emerge not wanting to discuss the issue anymore. So the level of intimidation is still there. and it dissuades people from doing so. But I think that space will open up a little bit, because as you have Taliban members questioning some of their policies, they will do that. And some of them in particular, and Hekmat and I know these individuals, are working on mechanisms through which Afghans can return and talk in Afghanistan. I think the danger is that if we start doing things outside, it'll be seen as a foreign-led, foreign-funded, whatever, endeavor. And I think it's a complicated issue, but I think we have to, amongst ourselves as Afghans, we have to come up with solutions ourselves. And the international community would need to obviously support it. The region has an important role. I think the Americans simply don't have the bandwidth, but the region can play a significant role, including the Qataris and others. And I think for the sake of everyone, I think this issue of radicals inside of Afghanistan is certainly one that the region should watch for very carefully.
Hekmat, Fawzia wasn't able to go into the country, so she had to look at it from nearby. But you were recently in Afghanistan. What did you see there? Did you see anything that felt to you like a needle had moved, that gave an opening for the things that Fawzia and Saad have been talking about, the need for Afghans to talk to the Taliban directly?
Let me make 2 points. First, on my visit, I went on because of a family issue. The one truly sad disappointment that I saw was that in the last 20 years, we had accumulated some of the brightest minds in Afghanistan. We had Afghans from all over the world, educated and come and work in different government positions or even in the private sector. Overwhelming amount are gone. International community, Western countries, United States, Canada, even Japan and others have taken these Afghans. So there's a massive brain drain. So you hardly see Afghans that you knew. So it's sort of like a tragedy, you see, in a way that, the last 20 years, this is how far we came now, all of them are gone. That's the one very sad and unfortunate thing that I saw. And also, the second thing that I saw was an enormous amount of checkposts, a military state, in a sense where you're constantly being stopped, constantly being asked. And I think insecurity, in a sense, is something that you sort of witness, that you sort of realize there. That's second point. I want to go back just very briefly and make a point particularly about, the way ahead. The international community, particularly, I think if you look at the Western country, they seem to have 3 priorities, and that's Ukraine, Ukraine, and Ukraine, which is, for them, it's fine. But that gives us an opportunity as Afghans to get our own elements together, to be able to rely on ourselves, to be able to realize that there is going to be no international partner that is going to hold our hand and walk us down the line somewhere. That is a great opportunity for us. For us as Afghan, what is important is that we have to learn our lesson, but at the same time, we're still dealing with that whole saying that the only thing we human beings learn from history is that we don't learn anything. So we keep making that mistakes, unfortunately. But there are Afghans that are coming together. There are Afghans that are creating these mechanisms for Afghans to talk to each other, because I think we have to talk to each other first, then to be able to talk to the Taliban. And that's sort of the 2-step process that is required at this stage for us to move forward. But I'm very much optimistic that within time the Taliban will realize that this road that they have taken is much more sufficient than the role that they were in before August 15, 2021. Thank you.
I've been given the 2-minute signal, so we have 30 seconds each. I know this is unfair, but this is the nature of the beast. I want each of you to, in 30 seconds, tell us what are the minimum conditions that would be required for you to go back to Afghanistan.
The minimum condition for me to go back is that I'm respected as a human being, that I can enjoy my rights and liberties like any other society, which I'm not. And I think one of the things Mr. Karzai was mentioning in the morning when he visited Kabul was the absolute absence of women from the streets of Kabul. We need to have a government that is accountable. We need to have a government that is representative. We need to have a government that is inclusive. Obviously, change will come from within. But if you don't give that enormous level of people that left Afghanistan the space for them to be able to talk among each other, how do they mobilize? Obviously, Taliban were fighting for 20 years and they were outside the country. Their leaders were outside the country. So that's how they worked. I think that's a narrative that we should apply again. But I believe in the leadership and the ownership of the people of Afghanistan, and I think we have to really rewrite the narrative, give the people of Afghanistan the space so that they do themselves. But at this stage, that space doesn't exist.
Hekmat?
Two very basic requirements. First and foremost, for girls to be able to go to school, for them to be able to decide their future, for them to be able to work, and for them to be able to set the path for their life. That's one. And second, to have a government that is representative of all Afghans, not just one particular segment of the population, where all Afghans, whether it's somebody from north, from the south, or anywhere, whether they're part of civil society or any part, for them to see themselves and take ownership of that government. That's it.
Saad, I know how much you like to have the last word.
Thank you. I'm your timekeeper. You have to run to the airport. I think I agree with my fellow Afghans on the importance of inclusivity. People have to feel that this is their government and it belongs to them, and they need to, feel that they're not outsiders in their own country. I think that inclusivity is very important. Women's, it's half the population. We cannot, do anything with Afghanistan with half our population locked up in their homes. The psychological impact it has on our girls is just, it's beyond words. But I think the other important thing is how can Afghanistan come out, come back from the cold? And I think one of the issues that we have to deal with, the region and us, is the terrorist organizations, foreign terrorist organizations within the country, because we have to get back on the road to legitimacy and recognition and lifting of sanctions. That's the only way Afghanistan is going to move forward. So these are the three important issues.
Fawzia, Hekmat, Saad, thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts here. We could have gone on, and I hope you will take the opportunity to grab them during coffee breaks and other opportunities to ask them all the questions that I ran out of time. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel.